The wall of orange stretched 14 miles across the western horizon, breathing and alive, consuming the September twilight with a hunger that turned the air itself into something thick and hostile. September 3rd, 1887, and the temperature had not dropped below 94 degrees in 11 days. 61 days without rain had left Sage Hollow, population 212 souls, surrounded by prairie grass that crackled underfoot like old parchment. The fire moved faster than a horse at full gallop, and those who had lived long enough on the Nebraska plains knew what that meant. What walked above ground would burn. What hid in shallow root cellars would suffocate. What ran would tire before the flames did. The smoke reached Sage Hollow 3 hours before the fire itself, rolling across the hardpan in great gray waves that stung the eyes and coated the tongue with ash. Families gathered their children. Men soaked blankets in water troughs that held barely enough to dampen the cloth. Women packed what could be carried and wept over what could not. And on the eastern edge of town, where 40 acres of rocky ground sloped gently toward a natural depression in the land, a woman named Bernadette Ironwood stood at the entrance to something the town had laughed at for 14 months. She did not run. She did not weep. She simply opened the iron door set into the hillside and waited. 3 years earlier, Bernadette had arrived in Sage Hollow on a freight wagon carrying everything she owned. 2 trunks of clothing, a set of stonemason tools that had belonged to her husband, 3 leather journals filled with her grandmother's observations on weather and animal behavior, and a blue roan mare named Amber, whose coat shifted between slate gray and dusty purple depending on the light. The wagon driver had charged her $4 extra for the horse, claiming the roads from Colorado were too rough for livestock that pretty. Bernadette had paid without argument. Amber was the last gift her husband had given her before the tunnel collapse took him, and there was no price she would not have paid to keep that mare at her side. The town had not known what to make of her. A widow, they understood. A woman traveling alone they could tolerate. But a woman who had finished her husband's work alone, who had crawled into a half-collapsed mining tunnel to shore up the remaining supports and seal the breach that had killed him, who had then collected his final wages and walked away from Leadville without looking back. That was something else entirely. That was unsettling. Her husband, Thomas Ironwood, had been a stonemason of considerable skill, a man who understood that rock was not an obstacle, but a partner. He had taught Bernadette everything he knew during their 7 years of marriage, and she had learned because she loved him, and because the work itself called to something deep in her bones. When the tunnel collapsed on April 14th of 1884, it took 3 days to reach his body. Bernadette had been among those digging. She had been the one to find him, still holding the chisel he had been using to shape a support beam, his face peaceful in a way that suggested the end had come quickly. The mine foreman had offered her compensation. She had refused. Instead, she had asked for permission to finish the section Thomas had been working on. They had given it to her out of pity, expecting her to fail within a day. She finished the section in 2 weeks. Then she packed her trunks and left Colorado forever. Her grandmother, Ingrid Halverson, had been a Norwegian coastal fisherman's daughter who married a Swedish carpenter and followed him to Wisconsin before the Civil War. Ingrid had died when Bernadette was 17, peacefully in her sleep after a long autumn of watching the geese and predicting the winter that would follow. Her last words to Bernadette had been simple. "The animals know what we have forgotten. Watch them, and you will never be surprised by weather again." Bernadette had watched. For 31 years since that autumn night she had observed the behavior of ground squirrels and meadowlarks, tracked the height of ant mounds and the depth of prairie dog burrows, noted when birds flew low for extended periods, and when cattle refused to graze in certain pastures. Her grandmother's wisdom had become her inheritance, as surely as the stonemason tools had become her husband's. When Bernadette chose her 40 acres in Sage Hollow, the land agent had laughed openly. "That hard pan will break every plow you put to it," he had said, wiping his spectacles on his shirt. "Rock shelf starts about 2 feet down and does not stop until you hit the devil's own doorstep. Even the weeds struggle to take root. Nobody has wanted that parcel in 30 years. Bernadette had smiled and signed the papers. Rock meant cool foundations that would not shift or settle. The slight depression in the land meant natural drainage, water flowing away from any structure she might build rather than pooling around it. Her grandmother had always said that the land nobody wanted held secrets nobody knew, and Bernadette had found the secret in that rocky hardpan within a week of arriving. A natural fissure running northeast to southwest, wide enough for a woman to stand upright, extending nearly 40 feet before narrowing to nothing. The earth itself had already begun digging. She would simply finish the work. The first summer, she built a modest cabin above ground while she studied the fissure below. Amber grazed contentedly on the sparse grass that grew between the rocks, and Bernadette spent her evenings writing in her grandmother's journals, adding her own observations to the generations of wisdom already recorded there. The meadowlarks in Nebraska behaved differently than those in Wisconsin or Colorado, but the principles remained constant. When ground squirrels dug deep, winter would be harsh. When ants built high, rain was coming. Or, if the mounds climbed twice their normal height with no rain following, something worse was building in the atmosphere. She began true excavation in March of 1886. The central chamber came first, a room 12 feet below the surface with walls of fitted stone and a ceiling supported by iron-banded timber beams. The stone she quarried from her own land, working alone with hammer and chisel, and a patience that seemed to have no natural limit. Each block weighed between 40 and 70 pounds, and she shaped them during the cool morning hours before the sun grew too fierce, then fitted them into place during the long twilight evenings. Her hands developed calluses upon calluses. Her shoulders ached constantly for the first 3 months. But the chamber took shape, and by June she had a space 16 feet across and 8 feet high, cool and dry and perfectly silent. The tunnels came next, radiating outward from the central chamber like spokes from a wheel hub. She dug them through the summer and fall, reinforcing as she went, spending $847 on iron bands and timber supports that the freight company delivered with undisguised curiosity. 3 tunnels, each extending just over 130 feet, angled slightly upward so that any water seeping in would drain back toward the central chamber and its hand pump connected to the deep well she had commissioned in her first month. The ventilation pipes alone took 2 months to install. Angled stone channels extending 30 feet from each tunnel entrance, designed to draw clean air from upwind and expel stale air without allowing smoke or embers to enter the main passages. By September of 1886, she had spent more money on tunnels than most Sage Hollow families earned in 3 years. The town had begun to notice. Bridger Drummond noticed first. Drummond was Sage Hollow's master builder, a man of considerable reputation who had constructed the town's finest structures. The 2-story bank with its imported brass fixtures, the Masonic Hall with its carved oak entrance, his own showcase home with glass windows shipped from Chicago. He had built well and charged accordingly, and he had done so for 22 years without competition. The arrival of a widow who worked with stone was an irritation. The construction of an underground chamber that made his own root cellars look like shallow scrapes in the dirt was an insult. He stood at the counter of Miller's General Store on a September afternoon, his voice carrying easily to the half-dozen customers examining bolts of fabric and barrels of flour. "That Norwegian fool is digging her own grave early," he announced, accepting his change from Harold Miller with the air of a man delivering profound wisdom. "Saves the rest of us the trouble when her tunnels collapse on her foolhead." Laughter rippled through the store. Harold Miller, a cautious man who preferred agreement to argument, nodded along. "Seems like a lot of work for a seller," he offered. A cellar. Drummond snorted. That is not a cellar. That is what happens when a woman tries to do a man's work without a man's sense. She will be buried in her own crazy cellar before winter comes. Mark my words. The nickname stuck. Within a week, the entire town knew Bernadette Ironwood's tunnels as the Crazy Cellar. Children whispered it to each other as they walked past her land on the way to school. Women murmured it at quilting circles, shaking their heads at the folly of widows who refused to remarry and let men handle such matters. Men invoked it at the saloon, using it as shorthand for any project too ambitious, too strange, too far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Bernadette heard the nickname for the first time at church, 3 Sundays after Drummond coined it. She had arrived early, as was her habit, taking her seat in the back pew where she could observe without being observed. But the Drummond family arrived moments later, and Martha Drummond, a handsome woman with the particular confidence of those who have never known true hardship, paused at the end of Bernadette's pew with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. I see the crazy cellar woman has managed to dig herself out long enough to join civilized society, Martha said, loud enough for the families in surrounding pews to hear. How thoughtful of her to grace us with her presence. Bernadette did not respond. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for the service to begin. That afternoon, Amber stood patiently in the cool shade of the cabin while Bernadette brushed the dust from her blue roan coat. The mare's ears flicked toward her mistress with each stroke, listening to words that no human in Sage Hollow would ever hear. They will see, eventually, Bernadette said softly. When the animals warn me and I speak, they hear only a Norwegian fishwife talking nonsense. But my grandmother read the North Sea through the behavior of gulls and terns and puffins, and she was never wrong. Not once in 63 years of watching. The Prairie speaks a different language, but the grammar is the same. Amber blew softly, her breath warm against Bernadette's palm. Let the wind carry their words, Bernadette continued, her voice steady and calm with a resolution that came from somewhere deeper than pride. I am building what my grandmother's eyes would recognize. She returned to her tunnels the next morning and did not stop working until the iron doors were finally hung in their stone frames, 3 weeks before the fire that would change everything. The iron doors weighed more than Bernadette had anticipated. She had commissioned them from a blacksmith in Grand Island, a taciturn German named Schultz, who asked no questions about why a widow needed 3 doors capable of sealing out smoke and flame. The specifications had been precise, each door to be constructed of 1/4-inch iron plate, fitted with rubber gaskets salvaged from railroad equipment, hinged on pins thick enough to support twice the weight of the door itself. Schultz had charged her $47 for the set, plus another $12 for the custom hinges, and had delivered them personally on a wagon reinforced with extra axles. You are building something serious, he had observed, helping her unload the first door into the wheelbarrow she used to transport materials to the tunnel entrances. Bernadette had nodded. I am building something my grandmother would understand. Schultz had not asked what that meant. He had simply collected his payment, tipped his hat, and driven his wagon back toward Grand Island without looking back. It was the most pleasant transaction Bernadette had conducted since arriving in Sage Hollow. The hanging of the doors consumed the final 3 weeks of August, 1887. Each door required a frame of fitted stone, mortared and sealed against the passage of air, with iron brackets embedded in the rock to receive the massive hinges. Bernadette worked through the hottest hours of the day, descending into the cool tunnels to escape the surface temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Sweat soaked through her work clothes within minutes of emerging into the sunlight, and she learned to time her above-ground tasks, hauling water, checking on Amber, studying the sky, for the early morning and late evening hours when the air was merely oppressive rather than murderous. The ventilation system required adjustment after the first door was installed. The angled stone pipes that drew air from upwind worked efficiently when the tunnel entrances were open, but the sealed doors changed the pressure dynamics in ways she had not fully anticipated. She spent 4 days redesigning the intake channels, adding a series of baffles that could be adjusted to control airflow without compromising the seal against smoke. The modifications cost her another $19 in materials and left her hands raw from handling rough-cut stone in the heat, but when she finally tested the completed system by sealing herself inside the central chamber and burning a pile of green grass at the tunnel entrance, no smoke penetrated the interior. She emerged from that test to find young Tom Ashford standing at a respectful distance, watching with undisguised curiosity. Tom was perhaps 18, the son of the town's only lawyer, a serious young man who had recently married a girl from the neighboring county and was attempting to establish himself as a farmer on land his father had purchased as an investment. He had the look of someone who knew he was being watched, who understood that his every decision would be scrutinized by those who had known him since childhood. "Mrs. Ironwood," he said, removing his hat, "I apologize for the intrusion. I was passing by and saw the smoke." "The smoke was intentional," Bernadette replied, brushing ash from her sleeves. "A test." "A test of what, if I may ask?" Bernadette considered the young man for a long moment. He had not laughed at her. He had not called her tunnels crazy or suggested that she was digging her own grave. He had simply asked a question and waited for an answer. "A test of whether smoke can penetrate a sealed door," she said finally. "It cannot." Tom Ashford nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the tunnel entrance to the stone-lined ventilation pipes visible along the hillside. "My wife's grandmother used to talk about root cellars back in Virginia. Said the ones that saved folks during Indian raids were the ones that could seal completely, keep out smoke from burning buildings above. Your wife's grandmother was a wise woman. She passed last winter." Tom replaced his hat and took a step back, preparing to leave. "I will not keep you from your work, Mrs. Ironwood. But if you do not mind my saying, I believe I understand what you are building here, even if others do not." He was gone before Bernadette could respond, walking back toward the road that led to his small homestead 3 miles east. She watched him go with something that might have been gratitude warming the tight space behind her ribs, then returned to her tunnels and did not think of the encounter again until much later. The provisions came next. Bernadette had spent the spring and summer of 1887 preserving everything she could acquire: vegetables from her small garden, fruit purchased from traveling merchants, meat she dried and sealed in crocks with layers of rendered fat. The glass jars alone cost her $31, purchased in batches from Harold Miller's general store despite the pointed silence that greeted her every time she entered. Miller would serve her, but he would not speak beyond the minimum required for commerce, and he would not meet her eyes. The other customers would pause their conversations when she approached the counter and resume them only when the door had closed behind her. She accepted this treatment without comment. Her grandmother had endured worse in Wisconsin, where the Norwegian families who settled along the lake shores were viewed with suspicion by the German and Swedish communities already established there. Ingrid Halvorsen had told her granddaughter stories of being spat upon in the street, of having her garden destroyed by neighbors who believed that Norwegians brought bad luck to fishing boats, of being refused service at shops and churches alike. She had survived by keeping her counsel and proving her worth through actions rather than words. Bernadette would do the same. The water storage system required the most careful planning. 40 gallons would sustain perhaps 12 people for 3 days if rationed carefully, but Bernadette had no intention of limiting her preparations to her own survival. The crocks she purchased were the largest available, each capable of holding 5 gallons when filled and sealed with wax-dipped cloth covers. She positioned them along the walls of the central chamber, elevated on stone shelves to protect against any water that might seep across the floor, labeled with the date of filling so she could rotate the stock and keep it fresh. The hand pump connected to her deep well was perhaps her greatest expense and her greatest reassurance. The well itself had cost her $123 to commission, drilled to a depth of 67 feet where it struck an aquifer that ran cold and clean regardless of surface conditions. The pump mechanism added another $41, but it meant that she could draw fresh water from within the central chamber itself, sealed away from any contamination above ground. By the end of August, the tunnels held everything required for extended survival: water, food, blankets, lanterns with sealed oil reserves, medical supplies purchased from the druggist in Grand Island who did not know her and therefore did not judge her. She had even brought down a small collection of books wrapped in oilcloth against moisture, because her grandmother had always said that the mind required nourishment as surely as the body. The mockery, meanwhile, had not abated. Bridger Drummond had refined his insults over the 14 months since coining the Crazy Cellar nickname, developing a repertoire of observations that he deployed at every public gathering. At the 4th of July celebration, while Bernadette stood at the edge of the crowd watching the fireworks display, Drummond had announced to his companions that the Norwegian mole woman had probably burrowed underground to escape the noise. At the harvest dance in late August, which Bernadette did not attend but heard about through the freight driver who delivered her latest shipment of supplies, Drummond had proposed a toast to the town's most dedicated gravedigger. "She will not need a funeral," he had reportedly said, raising his glass. "She has already built herself the finest tomb in Nebraska. All she needs now is the sense to lie down in it." Martha Drummond's social exclusion had proven equally effective. Bernadette received no invitations to quilting circles, church socials, or community suppers. The milliner refused to serve her, claiming that all hats were spoken for whenever Bernadette inquired. The dressmaker took her measurements but never completed the simple work dress Bernadette had ordered, eventually returning her payment with a curt note explaining that the shop was too busy to accept new commissions. Even the children had been recruited to the cause. Bernadette had watched from her cabin window as a group of schoolchildren walked past her property, their teachers steering them to the far side of the road and pointing at the tunnel entrances as an example of what happened when women forgot their proper place. Reverend Carlyle had been the final disappointment. The Reverend was a young man, barely 30, who had arrived in Sage Hollow 2 years earlier with a wife and infant son, and a determination to bring proper civilization to the Nebraska frontier. He preached sermons on community and fellowship, and the importance of welcoming strangers. But when Bernadette approached him after services in mid-August with her concerns about the coming fire season, he had patted her hand with the particular condescension reserved for women and children. "The Lord provides rain to the faithful," he had said, his smile suggesting that he believed her concerns to be a symptom of feminine hysteria rather than legitimate observation. "We have had dry summers before, Mrs. Ironwood. The prairie always recovers. The prairie dogs have abandoned their surface burrows," Bernadette had replied, keeping her voice steady despite the frustration building beneath her ribs. "The meadowlarks flew south 6 weeks early. The ants are building mounds twice their normal height. These are signs my grandmother taught me to read, and they all point toward fire." Carlyle's smile had not wavered. "Your grandmother was a fine woman, I am sure, but we must be careful not to let folk wisdom substitute for true faith. If the Lord intends fire, then fire will come regardless of what the animals do. And if he does not intend it, then we have nothing to fear." He had released her hand and stepped back, clearly eager to end the conversation. "Perhaps you should spend less time in those tunnels and more time in prayer. The darkness underground can play tricks on the mind." Bernadette had said nothing further. She had simply returned to her property and descended into the cool silence of her central chamber, where the stone walls held no judgment and the ventilation pipes drew clean air from a sky that cared nothing for reverends or their opinions. Bridger Drummond had heard about her conversation with Carlyle by sundown. She knew this because Drummond himself rode past her property the following morning, accompanied by his eldest son and 2 other men she recognized as members of the town council. They did not stop, but Drummond made certain his voice would carry as he passed. "Norwegian fishwives should stick to reading herring," he called out, his companions laughing at the wit of his observation. "The prairie is not the ocean, and tunnels are not boats. But perhaps the crazy cellar woman will discover that truth for herself when her rock shelter fills with dust and buries her alive." Bernadette stood at the entrance to her main tunnel, watching the riders continue toward town, and felt something cold and certain settle into her bones. She had tried to warn them. She had spoken her grandmother's wisdom to anyone who would listen, and they had responded with mockery and exclusion and the particular cruelty of those who believe their ignorance to be superior to another's knowledge. She would try no further. That evening, she led Amber to the small pasture behind her cabin and stood in the gathering darkness, one hand resting on the mare's warm neck, watching the western horizon where the sun was setting in colors that seemed too vivid, too orange, too much like fire. "They will not listen," she said softly, and Amber's ears turned toward her voice with the attentiveness of an animal who had learned that her mistress's words always carried meaning. "I have told Carlyle. I have told anyone who would permit me 30 seconds of their time. But the animals are clearer than my words, and the town cannot read them." The meadowlarks had left. Bernadette had watched the last flock disappear over the southern horizon 3 days earlier, 6 weeks before any normal migration. The ground squirrels had retreated so deeply into their burrows that even the sharpest eyes could not detect movement on the prairie surface. And the ants. The ants were building mounds that reached nearly 8 inches tall, towers of sand and soil that spoke of atmospheric pressure, changes that human instruments were too crude to measure. My grandmother could read the coming of storms in the way that terns circled above the harbor, Bernadette continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew when the fish would run deep by watching how the seals positioned themselves along the rocks. The prairie speaks differently, but the language is the same. Pressure, temperature, moisture. The animals feel it in their bones, and they respond. Amber blew softly, nudging her mistress's shoulder with a blue roan muzzle that caught the last light of the sunset. "Fire is coming," Bernadette said, "within weeks, perhaps days. The humidity has dropped so low that my skin cracks open when I work above ground, and the grass crumbles to dust beneath my boots. The town will burn unless rain comes, and no rain is coming. My grandmother's eyes would see it. The animals see it already." She paused, her hand stroking Amber's neck in long, slow movements. "And when the fire comes, they will remember that I tried to warn them. They will remember that they called me a fool and a mole and a grave digger. They will remember every time Bridger Drummond made them laugh at the Norwegian widow with her crazy cellar." The mare stood quietly, her breath warm against the cooling evening air. "But I will not refuse them," Bernadette said, and her voice carried no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction, only the quiet certainty of a woman who understood something that transcended personal grievance. "My grandmother saved 7 families during the storm of '62. Families who had refused her bread and mocked her husband's carpentry. She opened her doors because wisdom is not wisdom if it cannot be shared. Knowledge is not knowledge if it dies with the knower." She released Amber's neck and stepped back, looking once more at the western sky where the orange had deepened to crimson and then to purple. "Let the wind carry their words," she said, the same phrase she had spoken to the mare months earlier on the day Martha Drummond had humiliated her at church. "I am building what my grandmother's eyes would recognize. And when the time comes, those tunnels will hold anyone who needs them, whether they called me crazy or not." Amber nickered softly, and Bernadette led her back to the small stable she had constructed beside the cabin, a stable with a sloped entrance that connected, through a carefully concealed door, to the easternmost tunnel. The mare would survive as surely as any human. Bernadette had made certain of that. 3 weeks later, on the 3rd of September, the wall of orange appeared on the western horizon. Bernadette stood at her iron door and watched it come, and she did not run. She did not weep. She simply waited for the town that had mocked her to realize that the crazy cellar was the only shelter between Sage Hollow and annihilation. The fire did not announce itself with thunder or wind. It came in silence first, a silence so complete that the prairie dogs had stopped their warning calls and the coyotes had fled beyond hearing. The wall of orange that Bernadette had watched from her iron door grew taller as the minutes passed, and then taller still, until it seemed to consume the entire western sky from horizon to zenith. The temperature, which had held at 94 degrees through the afternoon, began to climb as the sun set. An impossibility that the residents of Sage Hollow would have dismissed as fever dream had they not felt it burning against their exposed skin. Bernadette did not move from her position at the tunnel entrance. She had made her preparations. She had issued her warnings. Now there remained only the watching and the waiting, and the opening of doors when the time came. The smoke arrived 3 hours before the flames, exactly as she had calculated. It rolled across the prairie like a living thing, a gray-brown serpent that coiled around fence posts and slithered through window cracks and wrapped itself around the throats of anyone foolish enough to remain outdoors. The smoke tasted of sage and buffalo grass and something older, something that spoke of the thousands of years the prairie had burned and regrown and burned again. Bernadette tied a dampened cloth across her nose and mouth. One of 40 such cloths she had prepared and stored in the tunnels, and continued her vigil. The first screams reached her ears at 8:30, carried on a wind that had shifted from the southwest and now pushed the fire directly towards Sage Hollow at a speed that defied comprehension. The flames moved faster than a horse could gallop, faster than a man could run, faster than thought itself when thought was paralyzed by terror. The wall of orange had become a wall of red and white, flames that leaped 60 feet into the air and threw embers half a mile ahead of the main blaze to start new fires that merged and grew and devoured everything in their path. Bernadette watched Bridger Drummond's lumber warehouse ignite. The structure had been his pride for 22 years, the largest commercial building between Grand Island and the Kansas border, stocked with seasoned oak and pine and walnut that represented thousands of dollars in inventory. The fire did not care about monetary value. The fire did not care about Bridger Drummond's reputation as the finest builder in Sage Hollow. The fire simply ate, and the warehouse fed it magnificently. The flames turned from orange to blue-white as they consumed the stacked lumber, the heat so intense that Bernadette felt it on her face from nearly a mile distant. The warehouse burned for 11 minutes. When it collapsed, the sound was like thunder trapped underground, a rolling boom that shook the earth beneath her feet. The Drummond home followed 7 minutes later. Martha Drummond had decorated that home with wallpaper imported from Boston and curtains sewn from fabric that had traveled by ship from England. She had hosted socials in its parlor and served tea from china that had belonged to her grandmother. None of it survived. The fire consumed wallpaper and curtains and china with equal indifference, reducing 20 years of accumulated gentility to ash and twisted metal in less time than it took to recite the Lord's Prayer. The temperature at the flame front reached 118 degrees. Bernadette knew this not because she possessed any instrument capable of such measurement, but because her grandmother had taught her the signs. At 100 degrees, exposed skin reddens but does not blister. At 110, blisters form within minutes. At 118, the moisture in human lungs begins to evaporate, and breathing becomes an act of self-immolation. The fire breathed. This was not metaphor. This was not poetic license. The fire inhaled, drawing air toward its center with such force that dust and debris and small objects flew toward the flames rather than away from them. Then the fire exhaled, belching superheated air and ash and embers in expanding waves that knocked grown men from their feet and stripped leaves from trees a quarter-mile ahead of the main blaze. The fire was a predator, and Sage Hollow was prey, and the predator was not merely hunting. The predator was feasting. Bernadette descended into her tunnel and sealed the iron door behind her. The central chamber felt cool after the inferno above, the stone walls maintaining a temperature of 62 degrees regardless of what burned on the surface. She had calculated this, had measured and tested and verified through 3 seasons of observation. 12 feet of earth and rock provided insulation that no above-ground structure could match. The fire could rage for days, and the tunnels would remain habitable. She lit the first of her lanterns and waited. Above her, the town of Sage Hollow burned. The general store went at 9:14, its shelves stocked with goods that Harold Miller had ordered 6 weeks earlier in anticipation of the autumn trade. Flour and sugar and coffee and bolts of fabric and tools and ammunition and patent medicines, all of it feeding the flames that showed no sign of satiation. The church followed at 9:31, its wooden steeple collapsing inward with a groan that sounded almost human. Reverend Carlyle had been so certain that the Lord would provide rain to the faithful. The Lord had provided fire instead, and the faithful scattered before it like leaves before a gale. 8-year-old Cecilia Marsh died clutching her doll in a root cellar on the eastern edge of town. Her parents had believed they were doing the right thing, the safe thing, the same thing their own parents had done when storms threatened. Root cellars had protected families from tornadoes for generations. But tornadoes did not fill enclosed spaces with smoke that displaced breathable air and turned a shelter into a tomb. Cecilia's father had sealed the door too tightly, believing he was keeping the fire out. He had kept the air out instead. When searchers found the family 3 days later, Cecilia was still holding her doll, a cloth figure with button eyes and yarn hair that had somehow survived when the child who loved it had not. Her face was peaceful. She had fallen asleep, her parents had told themselves. She had simply fallen asleep. The smoke had not been kind enough to allow such gentle passing. Smoke suffocation was agony disguised as drowsiness. The lungs burned, the eyes swelled shut, the throat closed around each desperate attempt to draw breath. Cecilia Marsh had died terrified and in pain, and her parents had died seconds later with the knowledge that they had killed their child through love misapplied. Jonas Whitfield refused to leave his chair. He was 73 years old and had lived in the same house for 41 years, since the day he had carried his bride across the threshold and promised her he would never abandon the home they built together. His wife had died 6 years earlier, and Jonas had kept that promise every day since, sitting in the same chair where he had held her hand during her final hours. When his neighbors came to drag him to safety, he had raised a shotgun and told them he would die where Sarah had died, and no fire would move him before his time. The fire moved him. The fire moved everything. When searchers found Jonas Whitfield, he was still seated in his chair, his body bent forward as if in prayer, his hands folded in his lap. The shotgun lay at his feet where it had fallen when his fingers could no longer grip it. His expression was not peaceful. His expression was the expression of a man who had discovered, in his final moments, that stubbornness and love were not the same thing, and that dying for a promise was not the same as honoring it. The Miller twins were 6 years old. They had been visiting their grandmother on the western edge of town when the fire appeared, and their father had sent them running toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Sage Hollow. The creek would be safety, he had told them. The creek would stop the fire. Their small legs had carried them nearly half a mile before the smoke overwhelmed them, before their lungs gave out and their bodies collapsed in the tall grass that would burn around them an hour later. The creek had dried to mud 3 weeks earlier. Their father found them holding hands, as they had always held hands since the day they learned to walk. They were identical in death as they had been in life. Two small bodies curled together in the ash, their faces turned toward the creek that had promised salvation and delivered nothing but cracked earth and broken hope. The fire burned for 41 hours. It swept through Sage Hollow on the night of September 3rd, retreated briefly as the wind shifted at dawn on the 4th, then returned with renewed fury when the wind shifted back. It consumed everything above ground level, every home, every business, every barn and stable and fence post and tree. It consumed the dreams of 212 souls and left nothing but ash and ember and the acrid smell of destruction. But it did not consume the tunnels. 12 feet below the surface, behind iron doors sealed against smoke, Bernadette Ironwood waited with her lanterns and her water and her preserved food and her steady certainty that the earth itself would protect those who had learned to trust it. She sat alone in the central chamber for the first 3 hours, listening to the muffled roar of the inferno above, feeling the faint warmth that penetrated even 12 feet of stone and soil. The temperature in the tunnels rose from 62 degrees to 68, a change so subtle that most would not have noticed it. Bernadette noticed. Bernadette noticed everything. The knock came at 11 minutes past 10 on the night of September 3rd. She had not heard footsteps on the sloped entrance. The roar of the fire above drowned all lesser sounds. But the knock was unmistakable. 3 sharp raps against the iron door that she had designed specifically to transmit vibration even when all other sound failed. Someone had found the tunnel. Someone had come. Bernadette rose from her seat on the stone bench she had carved along the eastern wall, lifted the lantern, and approached the door. The iron was warm to the touch, but not hot. The 30 feet of angled entrance had diffused the worst of the surface heat. She pressed her ear against the metal and waited. The knock came again, weaker this time. She lifted the locking bar and pulled the door inward. Tom Ashford stood in the entrance, his face blackened with soot, his hair singed at the edges, his arms wrapped around his pregnant wife's shoulders. Caroline Ashford was barely 19, her belly swollen with the child that would be born in 6 weeks if Providence allowed. She was crying, silent tears that cut tracks through the ash on her cheeks, and her hands were pressed against her stomach as if she could shield her unborn child through force of will alone. Tom's eyes met Bernadette's, and in them she saw something she had not seen from any resident of Sage Hollow in 14 months. Shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. His throat had been damaged by smoke inhalation, and his voice was a ragged whisper that barely reached her ears. "I told them," he managed. "When the fire came, I told them about your tunnels. Some of them." He coughed, a wet sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. "Some of them would not listen. But some of them are coming. Behind us." Bernadette did not hesitate. She stepped aside and gestured for them to enter, guiding them toward the water crocks and the dampened cloths and the bench along the eastern wall. "How many?" she asked. "I do not know." Tom's voice was steadier now, though still rough. 15, perhaps. Perhaps more. The Hendersons, the Carlyles, the Reverend, his wife, their infant, the Wilsons and their children. Others I could not see through the smoke. Bernadette nodded, her mind already calculating water rations and air supply and the distribution of bodies through the 3 tunnel branches. 40 gallons for 12 people for 3 days, she had planned. If 20 came, she would have water for 18 hours. If 30 came, she would manage. She had always managed. The eastern tunnel has the best ventilation, she said, her voice calm and clear and utterly without reproach. I will guide your wife there. You will stand at this door and direct others as they arrive. Tell them to move quickly and quietly, to cover their mouths with the cloths I will provide, and to follow the lanterns I will place along the passage. Tom stared at her for a long moment, his soot-blackened face illuminated by the lantern she held. Mrs. Ironwood, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. I did not. When Bridger Drummond called you. Later, Bernadette said. Her tone was not unkind, but it permitted no argument. Confessions require witnesses, and witnesses require survival. We will have time for words when the fire has passed. Now there is only the work of living. She pressed a bundle of dampened cloths into his hands and turned to lead Caroline toward the eastern tunnel. Behind her, she heard Tom take his position at the door, heard his voice, stronger now, fueled by purpose, calling out into the smoke-filled darkness. This way. The tunnels are open. This way. The others came throughout the night. The Hendersons arrived at 11:30, their 4 children ranging from 3 years to 12, their faces masks of terror and ash. The Carlyles followed at midnight, Reverend Carlyle carrying his infant son against his chest while his wife stumbled beside him, barely conscious from smoke inhalation. The Wilsons and the Garcias and the Petersons and families whose names Bernadette had never learned because they had never deigned to speak to her. All of them came, guided by Tom Ashford's voice and the faint light of the lanterns she had placed along the entrance passage. By 2 a.m, 37 souls sheltered in the tunnels beneath Bernadette Ironwood's worthless 40 acres. She organized them into groups, distributing water rations and teaching them to seal the iron doors between sections if smoke penetrated any individual tunnel. She showed them how the ventilation pipes drew clean air from upwind, how the angled design prevented ember intrusion, how the hand pump connected to the deep well could provide water indefinitely if the surface supply ran low. She taught them everything her grandmother had taught her, and everything her husband had taught her, and everything she had learned through 30 years of watching and listening and refusing to accept that wisdom belonged only to those who possessed formal education. And when the teaching was done, and the survivors were settled, and the children had finally stopped crying, Bernadette Ironwood retreated to the central chamber where she had spent 14 months of solitary labor, and she allowed herself a single moment of private grief for the town that had mocked her and the lives that had been lost because they would not listen. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and returned to the work of keeping the living alive. The fire burned until mid-morning on September 5th, retreating in stages like a predator reluctantly releasing its prey. Bernadette stood at the eastern tunnel's ventilation shaft at dawn, listening to the quality of the air that flowed through the angled stone channels, reading the temperature and the scent and the subtle pressure changes that told her what words could not. The roar had faded to a whisper. The heat that had pressed against the iron doors for 41 hours was dissipating. Above ground there would be nothing but ash and ruin. But above ground was now safe to breathe. She returned to the central chamber where 37 survivors waited in the lantern-lit darkness, their faces hollow with exhaustion and grief and the particular numbness that comes from losing everything in a single night. The fire has passed, she said. We will wait 2 more hours for the ground to cool, then begin assessing what remains. Reverend Carlyle stirred from where he sat against the western wall, his infant son sleeping fitfully against his chest. His voice was hoarse from the smoke he had inhaled during his midnight flight to the tunnels. What could possibly remain? We saw the flames. We heard... He stopped, unable to continue. Your lives remain, Bernadette said simply. That is more than some can say. The accounting of the dead took 3 days. Jonas Whitfield, 73 years old, found still seated in the chair where his wife Sarah had sat beside him for 41 years, until her death 6 years earlier. He had refused to leave, refused to run, refused to accept that the life he had built could end in anything but the chair where he had been happiest. The fire had granted his wish, after a fashion. Cecilia Marsh, 8 years old, discovered in the root cellar behind her family's home, her small body curled around a cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair. The cellar had seemed safe, had seemed deep enough, had seemed like shelter until the smoke that killed her proved that shallow holes in the ground were graves waiting to be filled. The Miller twins, Thomas and Theodore, age 6, found holding hands in the ash beside the creek bed on the eastern boundary. They had run toward water that no longer existed, toward salvation that had dried to mud 3 weeks before they needed it. Their father Harold found them and did not speak for 9 days afterward. Bridger Drummond's lumber warehouse, 22 years of accumulated timber and tools and contracts and reputation, burned to its foundations in 11 minutes. His showcase home with its Chicago glass windows and imported brass fixtures collapsed 7 minutes after that. The heat so intense that the glass melted into pools of crystalline ruin. Martha Drummond's Boston wallpaper and English upholstery fabrics vanished as if they had never existed, leaving nothing but the memory of a woman who had organized the exclusion of another woman who had tried to warn her. The Drummonds survived. They had fled east toward Grand Island on horseback, outrunning the flames by bare minutes, returning 3 days later to find their empire reduced to ash and their pride reduced to something even more insubstantial. Bernadette emerged from her tunnels that first morning to find a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Where Sage Hollow had stood, 212 souls worth of homes and businesses and dreams, there was only black earth and scattered stone foundations and the twisted remnants of iron stoves and bed frames. The prairie itself had been scoured clean, the tall grass that had crackled underfoot for 61 rainless days now nothing but fine gray powder that the wind lifted and scattered across the devastation. Her cabin was gone. She had expected that. But Amber's stable had also burned, and her heart clenched until she heard the familiar whinny from the eastern ravine where she had released the mare before sealing herself underground. The Blue Roan emerged from the rocky depression where she had sheltered throughout the inferno, her coat singed in patches, her mane shortened by heat, but alive. Alive and pressing her soft nose against Bernadette's palm as if to say that she had known to trust the earth her mistress had taught her to read. "Good girl," Bernadette whispered. "Good, brave girl." The survivors gathered at the tunnel entrance that evening, 37 souls who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to return to. Bernadette distributed the last of her preserved food, jars of vegetables and dried meat that she had canned through the previous summer, and taught them to draw water from the deep well she had commissioned in her first month of residence. The well still functioned perfectly, 67 feet of clean water that the fire could not touch, $123 that had seemed excessive at the time, and now seemed like the wisest investment anyone in Sage Hollow had ever made. "We will need to organize work parties," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent 14 months laboring alone toward a goal no one else could see. "The tunnels can shelter us through the winter if we expand the ventilation and add heating elements. There is stone on my land, enough to rebuild if we quarry it properly. And the railroad will bring supplies from Grand Island once we send word of what has happened here." Tom Ashford stood near the tunnel entrance, his pregnant wife Caroline seated on a stone bench Bernadette had carved months earlier for exactly this purpose. His throat had healed enough to speak clearly, though his voice still carried the rasp of smoke damage. "Mrs. Ironwood," he said, and the formal address carried weight it had never possessed when the town was prosperous, and she was merely the crazy cellar woman. "We have nothing to offer in return. Our homes, our savings, our tools, everything burned. "I did not build these tunnels to extract payment," Bernadette replied. "I built them because my grandmother taught me to prepare for what the animals already knew was coming. The preparation is complete. The sharing is simply what comes next." She taught them through October and November how to read the signs she had read, how to interpret the behavior of ground squirrels and meadowlarks and ants, how to understand that the prairie spoke a language older than human memory if only someone would take the time to listen. The survivors learned because they had no choice, because the woman they had mocked and excluded and dismissed as a Norwegian fool had been right when everyone else had been wrong, and because the tunnels she had built with her own hands were the only reason any of them still drew breath. The gathering came in October, on the 23rd day of the month when the first frost had silvered the ash fields and the survivors had begun to construct rough shelters above the tunnel entrances. Reverend Carlyle suggested it. His voice had recovered enough to preach, though what he preached now bore little resemblance to the comfortable sermons he had delivered before the fire. "We must speak what we have done," he said to the assembled community, his infant son cradled in his wife's arms. "We must confess our treatment of Mrs. Ironwood, and we must do so publicly, where all can hear and all can remember. The Lord does not forgive sins that remain hidden in the heart. They must be spoken aloud." The gathering took place in the central chamber of Bernadette's tunnel, the only space large enough to hold the 37 survivors and the handful of others who had returned from Grand Island and the surrounding homesteads. Lanterns lined the walls, their light casting flickering shadows across the fitted stone that Bernadette had shaped block by block through 14 months of solitary labor. The chamber was cool and dry, exactly as she had designed it, and the air that flowed through the ventilation pipes carried the clean scent of autumn frost rather than the ash that still coated everything above ground. Bridger Drummond stood first. He had aged a decade in the weeks since the fire. His hair, once thick and dark and carefully pomaded, had gone gray at the temples and thin across the crown. His shoulders, once squared with the confidence of a man who had built an empire through 22 years of uninterrupted success, now curved inward as if trying to protect a heart that had been broken too many times to count. His hands, the hands that had wielded hammer and saw and level with the precision of a master craftsman, trembled as he gripped the brim of his hat. "I called her a Norwegian fool digging her own grave," he said, and his voice cracked on the word grave. "I stood in Miller's General Store, and I said those words where everyone could hear them, and I laughed when others laughed, and I coined the name that followed her for 14 months, the Crazy Cellar. I said it would collapse on her head. I said she was trying to do a man's work without a man's sense." He paused, struggling to control the tremor in his voice. The chamber was silent except for the soft whisper of air through the ventilation pipes. "My warehouse burned in 11 minutes. 22 years of work, 22 years of reputation, 22 years of believing I knew better than a widow with calloused hands and a blue roan horse. Gone in 11 minutes. My home, the home Martha and I built together, the home where we raised our children, the home with windows from Chicago and fixtures from Boston and wallpaper that Martha chose because it reminded her of her mother's parlor in Virginia. That home collapsed in 7 minutes. I watched it fall. I watched everything I had built fall, while the tunnels I mocked stood firm." He turned to face Bernadette directly, and tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "Mrs. Ironwood sheltered my children when I could not. She gave them water and food and safety when my proud buildings offered nothing but ash and death. She did this without hesitation, without reproach, without demanding the apology I owe her more than I owe any debt I have ever carried. I ask her forgiveness for my pride and my blindness and my cruelty. I ask it knowing I do not deserve it. I ask it because I must speak the words aloud or carry them as stones around my neck for whatever years remain to me." He lowered his head and said nothing more. Martha Drummond rose next, her face pale and drawn, her hands clasped before her in the attitude of prayer. I told her she had managed to dig herself out long enough to grace civilized society with her presence, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I said those words in church, before the service, where God Himself could hear my meanness. I organized the exclusion. I made certain she received no invitations, no greetings, no service at the milliner's. I told the other women that associating with the crazy cellar woman would reflect poorly on their families, and they listened because I had spent 22 years building the kind of reputation that made other women listen. She drew a shuddering breath. When the fire came, I had nothing. My reputation, my social standing, my beautiful home with its English fabrics and its Boston wallpaper, all of it burned while I fled on horseback toward Grand Island, leaving behind the town I had ruled like a petty queen. And when we returned, when we saw what remained of Sage Hollow and learned who had survived, I discovered that the woman I had excluded from civilized society was the only reason civilized society still existed. I ask her forgiveness. I ask it with shame so deep I can barely speak the words. She sat down abruptly, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Harold Miller rose more slowly, the general store owner who had nodded along with Drummond's mockery and sold Bernadette supplies while refusing to meet her eyes. I told Bridger it seemed like a lot of work for a cellar, he said, his voice flat with the exhaustion of a man who had found his twin sons holding hands in the ash beside a dry creek bed. I did not call her names myself, but I laughed when others did. I took her money and gave her flour and nails and preserved goods, but I never once asked her why she was building what she was building. Never once considered that a woman who had finished her husband's work in a collapsed tunnel might know something about underground construction that I did not. His voice broke entirely. My boys, Thomas and Theodore, they ran toward the creek because I taught them that water meant safety. I taught them that, and I was wrong, and they died holding hands because their father did not know enough to build tunnels instead of root cellars. He pressed his palms against his eyes. I cannot ask Mrs. Ironwood's forgiveness. I can only say that I was wrong, and that my sons paid the price for my wrongness, and that I will carry that knowledge until I die. He did not sit down so much as collapse into the arms of his wife, who held him as he wept. Reverend Carlyle rose last among the confessors, his young face aged beyond its 30 years, his infant son sleeping peacefully in his wife's arms. I patted her hand, he said quietly. When Mrs. Ironwood came to me 3 weeks before the fire and warned me that the animals were behaving strangely, that the meadowlarks had flown south 6 weeks early, that the prairie dogs were abandoning their surface burrows, I patted her hand and told her the Lord provides rain to the faithful. I spoke those words as if faith were a substitute for preparation, as if prayer could replace the practical wisdom that her grandmother had passed down through generations of watching and listening and understanding what the animals already knew. He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless confession. 3 people died because they would not listen. Jonas Whitfield, who refused to leave his chair. Cecilia Marsh, who hid in a root cellar that filled with smoke. The Miller twins, who ran toward water that had dried to mud 3 weeks before they needed it. 3 people, and perhaps more, would have died if Tom Ashford had not remembered the tunnels and guided us here in the darkness and the smoke. I ask Mrs. Ironwood's forgiveness for my spiritual pride, for my assumption that faith excused me from the hard work of preparation, for dismissing her warning as the superstition of a Norwegian fishwife when she was offering me the accumulated wisdom of generations. He sat down, and the chamber fell silent, and 37 pairs of eyes turned toward Bernadette Ironwood, who had listened to every word without expression, her hands folded in her lap, her face illuminated by lantern light that cast no shadow of judgment. She rose slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority that had sustained her through 14 months of mockery and 3 days of crisis. My grandmother used to say that every jar stored is a promise kept to tomorrow, she began. She learned that wisdom from her mother, who learned it from hers, who learned it from generations of Norwegian fishermen's daughters who understood that the sea does not care about pride or reputation, or the opinions of neighbors. The sea comes, and the storm comes, and those who have prepared survive while those who have not do not. The prairie is the same. The fire came, and it did not care that Bridger Drummond had built the finest structures in Sage Hollow, did not care that Martha Drummond had organized the most exclusive social circles, did not care that Harold Miller sold the best goods, or that Reverend Carlyle preached the most comforting sermons. It came, and it burned, and it left behind only what had been built to endure. She paused, and her eyes moved across the gathered survivors, meeting each gaze in turn. I cannot grant forgiveness for what was never mine to withhold. You did not wrong me personally when you laughed at my tunnels. You wronged yourselves, and your children, and the neighbors who might have built their own shelters if anyone had stopped to consider that a woman who finished her husband's work in a collapsed mining tunnel might know something worth learning. The earth saved you, not my forgiveness. The stone and the iron and the timber saved you, shaped by hands that learned from a stonemason husband and a Norwegian grandmother and 30 years of watching what the animals already knew. Her voice softened slightly. But I can teach you. I can teach anyone who wishes to learn. The meadowlarks and the ground squirrels and the ants. They speak a language older than any human tongue, and they have never been wrong in 63 years of my grandmother's observation, or 31 years of my own. If you wish to learn that language, I will teach it. If you wish to learn how to build shelters that endure when everything above ground burns, I will teach that too. This is not forgiveness, because forgiveness implies that something was taken from me and must be returned. This is simply what comes next. This is the work of living. She sat down, and the gathering ended, and the work of rebuilding Sage Hollow began in earnest. 43 years later, in the autumn of 1930, over 100 Nebraska homesteads had what their owners called ironwood tunnels. The design had spread from Sage Hollow to Grand Island to Omaha and beyond, carried by the children and grandchildren of the survivors who had sheltered in Bernadette's central chamber on the night of September 3, 1887. Each tunnel was built to her specifications. 12 feet below ground, stone-lined, ventilated through angled pipes, sealed with iron doors against smoke and ember. Each one represented the practical wisdom of a Norwegian grandmother passed through a Wisconsin childhood to a Colorado marriage to a Nebraska homestead, where nobody had believed that worthless hardpan could hold anything of value. The phrase, crazy cellar, transformed over those decades, its meaning inverting so completely that newcomers to the region often failed to understand why the highest compliment anyone could pay was to say that someone built like an ironwood or thought like a crazy cellar woman. In Sage Hollow itself, which had rebuilt into a prosperous community of over 400 souls, the term was spoken with something approaching reverence. She is a real crazy cellar meant someone whose practical wisdom others could not yet see. It meant someone who prepared for disasters that reasonable people did not believe could happen. It meant someone who watched the animals and listened to the earth and trusted the accumulated knowledge of generations over the comfortable assumptions of the present moment. Bridger Drummond became her most devoted student. In the years following the fire, he abandoned his career as a master builder of above-ground structures and devoted himself to learning everything Bernadette could teach him about underground construction. He quarried stone from her land and shaped it with tools his own hands had to learn to use. He installed ventilation pipes and sealed iron doors and dug tunnel after tunnel until his shoulders ached and his palms bled, and his body understood what his mind had been too proud to accept before the fire taught him humility. By the time he died in 1912, at the age of 74, He had built more ironwood tunnels than any other person in Nebraska, except Bernadette herself. His final words were spoken to her in the central chamber where he had confessed his mockery 25 years earlier. "You were right," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "about everything. The tunnels, the animals, the wisdom that comes from watching instead of assuming. I spent 22 years building structures that burned in minutes, and 25 years building structures that will outlast my grandchildren. Thank you for teaching me the difference." Amber died in the spring of 1903, 16 years after the fire, her blue roan coat still shifting between slate gray and dusty purple in certain lights. Bernadette buried her in the rocky depression where the mare had sheltered from the flames, marking the grave with a stone that read simply, "She trusted the earth." Bernadette herself lived until 1929, dying peacefully at the age of 81 in the cabin she had rebuilt above her tunnel entrance. Her hands, calloused from a lifetime of working stone, remained steady until the end. Her eyes, trained by her grandmother to read weather through animal behavior, never lost their clarity. She spent her final decades teaching children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the survivors, teaching newcomers who arrived in Sage Hollow expecting nothing and left knowing how to read the prairie, teaching anyone who asked and many who did not know they needed to ask until she showed them what they did not know. The tunnels still stand. The central chamber remains exactly as Bernadette built it, 12 feet below the surface, 16 feet across, 8 feet high, lined with fitted stone that she shaped block by block through 14 months of solitary labor. The town maintains it now, using funds collected from the descendants of the 37 survivors who sheltered there on the night of September 3, 1887. Schoolchildren visit each spring to learn about the fire and the woman who saw it coming when no one else would listen. Historians document the ventilation system and the iron doors and the deep well that still provides clean water from 67 feet below the prairie surface. Above the entrance, carved into a stone lintel that Bernadette shaped with her own hands in the summer of 1890, an inscription remains as clear as the day she chiseled it. "Every tunnel is a promise kept." The words belong to her grandmother now, passed through stone to strangers she never met, carried forward through generations who will remember Ingrid Halvorson's wisdom long after they have forgotten her name. The Norwegian fisherman's daughter who married a Swedish carpenter and followed him to Wisconsin before the Civil War, who watched the geese and predicted winters, who taught her granddaughter that the animals know what humans have forgotten. She would have recognized those words. She would have understood that her legacy lived not in the journals Bernadette kept or the tunnels Bernadette built, but in the simple truth that preparation is love made practical, and wisdom is nothing more than watching closely enough to see what was always there. Ingrid Halvorson would have been proud.